say that back in the 1970s, 1 in 25 males born in the US was a Michael. That was a very common name. Back then, Jacob wasn't such a common name, but now you change and you look how over from 1967 to 1997, Jacob multiplies by a factor of about 100. Well, people have been able to study personal names recently using archaeology. And there's been a study of about 3,000 names that people were called back then. And we can say that Jewish names in the land of Palestine were different from Jewish names elsewhere, and yet the Gospels and Acts are probably written elsewhere, and yet they've got the right sort of names. That's the remarkable thing we're going to find. They've got the right pattern of names. Let's put some more flesh on that. The argument began with a researcher in Germany, but it's a list simply of all the names that people were called at the time, and so you can go through and get the information. Then along comes a British researcher, and he says, well, let's look at that and correlate that with the Gospels and see if there's any tie-up between what people were called outside the New Testament and what they're called inside the New Testament. And what we find is something rather remarkable. It's a very small chart here, not everyone will be able to see. But basically the most common name inside the New Testament for males, Palestinian Jewish males, is Simon. It's the top name for the New Testament, top name for Josephus, who's a historian of the first century, a Jewish historian, top name in the bone boxes that they had, the ossuaries, and it's the second top name in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We take the second name in the New Testament. It's Joseph, the second most common name. It's second most common also in Josephus and in the bone boxes. It's the most common one in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We see a significant correlation. Looking at it another way, take the two top Palestinian Jewish male names together and you find nearly 16% of men were called one of those two names. Inside the New Testament it's 18%. We go and take the top 9 men's names together and we find outside the New Testament 41%, inside the New Testament 40%. That is incredibly close, and that is statistically significant because we're using a bigger data sample. As the data sample gets bigger, the numbers get closer. So we can look then at the ranks of names, and we can say, look at Jewish males in Palestine, and we could say, these are the ranks of the names we've got in the New Testament. And then we could say, let's go to another country where there are lots of Jews in Egypt, and we find a different pattern of names. Now that's a remarkable thing. Now I've got a question here tonight, and it won't work in the overflow, but at least I can find out from people here in the chapel. Does anyone here know anyone called Sabbathias? No? No? No one? Anyone? Pappus? Ptolemaeus? No? Dog? Not even a pet? No? Okay. Why not? Because the Gospels weren't written about Jewish men in Egypt. If they'd been written about Jewish men in Egypt, sure, those names would have become quite common for us, but they haven't.
So I have to say, when I saw this, it struck me as maybe the most powerful evidence I'd seen for the historical reliability of the New Testament documents, particularly the Gospels and the Book of Acts. Just very briefly, Book of Acts is a sequel to the Gospel of Luke, with the same author. So this is all research that was originally kind of developed by a scholar named Tal Ilan. She published in 2002, and then 4 years later, Richard Bauckham, who's leans very much to the conservative side of biblical scholarship, but is very much a legitimate biblical scholar, picked up on this research and developed it himself. And if you think about it, it's hard to imagine how this type of information could have been preserved under the circumstances of the time. It's not just as simple as, they didn't have Google. They didn't have bookstores. There were very limited libraries. Ability to obtain knowledge in those days is just so foreign to us. But just think of it on our own terms. If someone said you can't use Google, write a story about somebody, a group of people from the neighboring state of yours, and try to name the characters as historically accurate as you can, give them the ages of, let's say, anywhere between age 20 and age 50. And could you do it? Could you do it as a writer? And then we're talking about neighboring states of the United States. I think if you can't use Google, people can go to the libraries and try to look up, most common names for those areas. The question is, would they even try to do that, or would they just kind of try to wing it? And of course, in ancient times, it wasn't a matter of like going to the library. That's to the extent there are books, there is a library that exists, and there are scrolls that are available with certain information. It's not going to have that kind of information. It's not going to have, here are the most common birth rates or birth names in Galilee and Judea from the year 5. I mean, that's just, it's just not going to, that information is not going to be there. That information wouldn't have existed 200 years ago, unless you looked at like census records. And if you go back a little bit, 200 years before that, there are certain countries like, England that would preserve it locally, but for the most, and Germany would, the German provinces might preserve it, but for the most part, you're not going to get that information. And, the Judea and Galilee were not the heart of the Roman Empire. These were not people living in Rome, or even Asia Minor. So or Greece. I mean, these are people living in a distant part of the empire, speaking a different language than everybody else. So this information is just not going to be available. So the question is, how is this preserved? If this information is being preserved and we get it into the documents, can that be done just by oral transmission? And if it can be, if we can preserve these names using kind of the oral tradition method, who's to say we can't preserve the actual stories themselves? Indeed, I would argue, and I think you probably agree with this, if you think about it, it's much easier to remember the stories themselves and the details of stories than to remember specific names of the characters. I mean, if you walk out of a movie and you could probably describe the entire movie to a friend, everything that happened, but you may forget the majority of the characters, even the lead character, unless it's very prominent or you're going to see like some sort of Marvel movie, you'll very quickly forget the names of characters. And those are the lead characters, let alone these like kind of tertiary characters as we see in the New Testament documents. So it does not make sense that these things would be, that the names and these naming conventions are going to be preserved, but the underlying stories won't. It just doesn't make sense. So when you're hearing claims that this is historical fiction, if it's a historical fiction, it's like a deliberate fraud committed by somebody with on the ground knowledge. They know all the people's names, or they know what the people's names would sound like. You'll see more in this presentation, just also geography, some elements of botany. But this is just really, really powerful. And what Peter Williams is about to go into is to compare these canonical gospels that we know were written in the 1st century to what we start seeing develop in the 2nd century gospels. Are they able to preserve this information? And spoiler alert, no, they are not.
Now I want to take this idea a little bit further. Now you've all heard, I'm sure, about apocryphal gospels, and people have said, hey, what about having some other gospels in the Bible? Well, let's just look at how they do on other names. So the Gospel of Thomas, one of the most popular ones that people talk about, and you look at how does it do with Palestinian Jewish names? Not very well. The main character is called Didymus Judas Thomas, which means twin, Judas twin, which is just not the sort of name people were called back then. You could look at another gospel, the Gospel of Mary. It doesn't even call Jesus Jesus, it just calls him the Savior. And it's, which Mary? We have no idea. And then you've got the Gospel of Judas, which was published recently, and it's got 2 Palestinian Jewish names. Jesus and Judas. And then it's got a whole load of people from outer space. The rank of that name for Palestinian Jewish males, if it is in the top 99 names. And what we find is if it's one of the more common names, it has a qualifier. If it's not one of the more common names, it does not have a qualifier. Let's go through the list. So, Simon, ranked number 1, qualifier, called Peter, and Andrew, not ranked, his brother. So Andrew's just given with reference to Simon. James, high ranking, 11. The son of Zebedee, and John, rank 5, his brother. Philip, low ranking, 61st equal, no qualifier. Bartholomew, 50th equal, low ranking, no qualifier. Thomas, not even in the top 99, low ranking, no qualifier. And Matthew, high up, rank number 9, qualifier, the tax collector. James, high ranking, 11th, the son of Alphaeus. And Thaddeus, 39th equal, low ranking, no qualifier. Simon, rank number 1, the Cananaean. Judas, rank number 4, Iscariot, who also betrayed him. Now I know there are other things going on with that list as well, but the point is this: these statistics have only been known since 2003. You see, and what we're finding is a correlation between that list of ancient names and statistics that have only been known recently. But it doesn't just work with lists, it also works with dialogue. Now, one of the things about the name John is it's actually quite a common name, rank number 5. So when Herod wants to say about Jesus that he thinks he's John the Baptist, come back from the dead, he cannot simply say to his servants, this is John, because his servants would have said, which John? We've got several Johns that work in the palace, that it doesn't really help us. So he says, this is John the Baptist. Then the narrator continues, so Herod sees John. Now the narrator doesn't need to give a further qualification because the narrative makes it quite clear which John we're talking about. The narrator goes on, and so John said. But when Herodias' daughter wants the head of John the Baptist, she can't just say, give me John's head. She might have got the head of the wrong John. So she says, give me the head of John the Baptist. Yeah? And then the narrator immediately continues, and so he sent and beheaded John. Now you see the way it's distinguishing the way the narrator speaks from the way the characters in the narrative speak. So one of the things that we would expect to be the case is if people were writing stories a long way away, they're not going to know the names of places. Well, look at the names of places we get in the 4 Gospels. The most common town name is Jerusalem, the capital city. The second most common is Nazareth, the town associated with Jesus. But it's not just that you have those two known, you also have some quite obscure villages known. Places like Bethphage, a little village near Jerusalem. You get Chorazin, known up in Galilee. Well, the question is this: how would someone in Syria, in Turkey, in Greece, in Italy, in Egypt know about the names of those villages? I mean, I just can't think how they would know. In Rome, probably the best place to go to a bookshop. Well, if you went and bought a book about geography, it would tell you about the great places on earth to go and see before you die. Which didn't include Bethphage, which didn't include Chorazin, you see? So what you find is, how would people well away from the place know these things? And it's not just that they know the names of places, they know things about them. They know that Capernaum is next to the sea. They know the way where the land goes up and down. They know traveling times, all those sorts of things. How do they get that right? We compare that with what's mentioned in apocryphal Gospels. The 4 canonical Gospels, 12 to 14 towns each, total of 23. Gospel of Philip, 2 towns, Jerusalem and Nazareth. But it thinks that Nazareth is Jesus' middle name, so that's not very good. So it's only really got one place correctly mentioned, that's Jerusalem, which is the capital. What about Gospels of Peter and of the Saviour? They've got one town and it's called Jerusalem, the capital. And what about 13 other earliest apocryphal Gospels? How many town names have they got? 0. So all of the correctly placed town names in the 16 earliest apocryphal Gospels and fragments, 1. Jerusalem, the capital of the whole area. That to me is not very impressive geographical knowledge. But it also means that rather than being evidence against the 4 Gospels, the apocryphal Gospels are in fact evidence for the 4 Gospels, because they show what would happen if people did make up stories. They are the controlled experiment, if you like, that show what could go on another way. Now I want us to look at the number of words there are in the 4 Gospels. That's the 4 left-hand columns, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, and I've given you 5 non-biblical Gospels on the right-hand columns. Okay, I want you to fix your eyes on those 4 left-hand columns very carefully and look at their shape. I've just changed slide to the number of place names. This is not just town names, this is places like Golgotha, river names and so on. Did you notice the change of shape? This is the number of words per gospel. This is the number of place names per gospel. You notice this sort of big drop-off effect here. They're just not very good on place names. But there's another thing. What if we do place names as a proportion of length? What happens? Ooh. we find that all four Gospels have an amazing evenness of place name mentions. I began looking at this in an English version, had someone do a bit of research for me, and I said to her, I have a suspicion that place names occur more in the four canonical Gospels than in the other ones. Could you go and look at it? So she worked on an English translation, English Standard Version. She found that the four canonical Gospels, between 4.6 and 4.9 place names per 1,000 words. That was what you wanted to know tonight, wasn't it? Are there sycamore trees in Jericho? The answer is, you bet. You see, look here, there are some guys in this sycamore tree in Jericho. You see that? They are standing in Jericho. Now, how could Luke know that? I have three possibilities, but let's start with the first two. One possibility is he went to Jericho and he saw there are sycamores. The other is he spoke to someone who went to Jericho who saw there were sycamores. The third possibility is aliens from outer space told him. But I'm going to discount that third explanation. There may be others, but let's just focus on those first two. Those first two seem to me the most worthy of consideration. What we've got is, this is the sort of thing that people who've been to the place know.
So Peter now in this last series of clips has expanded upon the original point about the uniqueness of the names and how they got that correct, and how difficult it would be and unlikely, improbable it would be to get those names correct unless you had hands-on information from that time and that place. The next point he makes is a great corollary, which is how the common names are the ones that get descriptors. Mary from Magdala, John the son of Zebedee, because John's a common name. Simon, the one they call Peter, because Simon is a common name. So on and so forth. Peter follows that up with the analysis of geography. Now, this is not really a new discovery. The issue of how close the gospel writers were to the actual geography they're describing has been the subject of much scholarly debate and many books. But what Peter is pointing out is that the gospel writers are actually getting the names of places correct in the area. Now, there's debate about how they situate these towns. This is very difficult because, these are not people who would be orienting themselves based upon maps. They're orienting themselves based upon how they travel and walk to places. And this is something, if you're a little bit older and you ever learned to drive around before the era of Google Maps, you may have learned different routes in your local neighborhood at the fastest way to get to here or there. And then when Google Maps comes around, you figure out that, wow, actually these routes that I was using were not necessarily the shortest, or they didn't actually take you in the precise direction you thought you were going. So obviously in this time period, people did not have maps to travel, or at least to the extent they had maps, they were very crude maps. They're not based upon satellite imagery, and they were not actually based upon all kinds of measurements being taken by experts to create these maps. So the fact that the gospel writers are that close indicates they were there, or they spoke to someone who was there, and they had a really good idea of where these places were relative to one another. And then finally, just some issues on botany and just what kinds of plants are in what places, and what type of year you might have green grass as opposed to yellow grass. And this is another thing they get right. It's just something that's highly improbable you would ever get close to right if you didn't have eyes on the scene, direct information. Okay, so now we're going to switch to a debate that Peter J. Williams is having with Bart Ehrman on the Unbelievable podcast, which is a tremendous podcast. I encourage everyone to either watch it on YouTube or listen to it on their favorite podcast platform. And we're going to pick up right after Peter has kind of presented all this evidence as part of his argument, and then get Bart's reaction. A couple notes before we start. As I think as strong as presentation that Peter made from the podium in the prior segments, once he's sitting at a table with Bart Ehrman, I don't know if it's deer in the headlights or what, but clearly he is not a strong debater, and that comes across here. And I'm going to kind of try to pick up and move into some spaces where he didn't make arguments he should have been making.
So quite a lot of detail there about times, places, events, language that Peter feels tie the Gospel of Luke and Acts to someone who knew his stuff, close to the events in that way. you say none of this really actually impacts the way in which you see actually the problems that exist with,
the
narrative.
Yeah, no, that's right. So I mean, we will have some differences on whether everything's accurate in Luke and Acts in terms of geography and such. So we could argue those out. Those tend to be kind of technical little arguments. I should say that Peter's not arguing that necessarily it's early. As you summarized, he's saying he's not committing to a date. Luke Acts might be after 70, it might be 40, 50 years later. He's acknowledging that, but he's saying that the author's done a lot of research to come up with this information.
Right away, you'll see Bart's response, and I'm going to kind of pick at it piece by piece. And his first responses are to say, one, that, oh, well, we have some disagreements as to whether or not they got the places correct. That's highly technical. And then there's no discussion about that. Spoiler, there's no discussion about whether or not they got the places correct or not. He just kind of says it's a technical argument, so I'm just going to bypass it. That is not an argument. Okay. This is highly technical. We disagree. That's not an argument. Okay. You need to present arguments. And then once you present your side, why they're not getting these places correct, or the names of places correct, or adequately correct, given the available information at the time, then you can respond. But he just brushes this aside and says, oh, it's highly technical and I just have a different opinion. That's not an argument. So the very first thing, he's coming out of the box, no argument. The very second thing he talks about is the dating of only the books of Luke and Acts, which, as I mentioned before, have the same author. And he says, well, Peter's not committing to an early date on these. It could be 40 years, 50 years, whatever, after the year 70, even potentially, who knows. The problem here is what I just discussed previously, which is, if this is all the product of oral tradition, you're going to have a very tough time getting all this information correct. Now, another spoiler alert here. Even if the author of Luke Acts did a tremendous amount of research, when it comes to stuff that's taking place in Judea, after the year 70, things are very different, because between the year 66 and 70, the Roman Empire essentially invaded Judea. Judea was already a Roman province, but there was a rebellion, and they invaded and they sacked Jerusalem and essentially burned the temple to the ground. So a lot of information is being lost after the year 70. People are moving out of that area. It's been sacked by the Roman Empire. It's no longer under the control of Jewish authorities or even the Jewish population. So just inherently, the further you push it back time-wise, the more trouble you get into. It just makes things more complicated. So this is just kind of running right into the Occam's razor. What's the simplest explanation? Is the simplest explanation that this was written many decades later and somehow this information was gathered and it was accurate and apparently the product of oral tradition lasting decades longer than possible? Or is the simplest explanation that, oh, this was recorded at an earlier period, perhaps even before the fall of the temple, at a time when it was much easier to get that information and to get it accurately?
I personally don't think he did a lot of research. I mean, I think that we can get to my views about how it happened, but I'll say that I think that the entire argument that he's making doesn't really relate to the issue we want to discuss.
And again, we see the exact same type of technique here from Bart, sweeping something aside without discussing it. He says, I don't think, in this case, Luke did research. Now, it's not clear if he means by research that he went and, traveled around different areas and trying to get names of places correct. We didn't really discuss this video, the book of Acts, but there's a ton of historical information in the book of Acts that'll be a different video. And I don't know if that's what Bart's referring to, or if he's just referring to what's in the Gospel of Luke as far as the reports and the information that Luke records. Luke is the longest Gospel, and between Luke and Acts, I think it constitutes close to half of the entire material of the New Testament. But Bart just brushes that aside. He says, I don't think Luke did research. We could talk about why I think that way, but we're not going to talk about why I think that way, because I'm not going to debate that point. I'm just going to sweep it aside. And then we go directly into Bart's attempt to change the subject, because with the very next thing he says is, oh, we're talking about the wrong thing. We shouldn't be talking about what Peter wants to talk about here. Let me talk about what I want to talk about here. And that's what we're going to fill the rest of this video with, is these kind of distractions. So Peter has just laid out this very kind of sophisticated argument about how it would be nearly impossible to get all this information that's recorded in the Gospels unless it's coming very close to the source at the time and the place. And Bart will not respond. He wants to change the subject. He wants to deflect. He will not respond. We need to take note of that. It's a tactic that a biblical scholar should not be using under these circumstances. If he wants to disagree, that's fine. Make an argument why Peter's wrong. Make an argument why this information is not as powerful as what Peter says. Now, Bart's going to come up with an argument here in a few minutes, but it's highly flawed and really still fails to address the problem. So let's continue watching.
The reason is because if Luke is accurate in terms of what trees were in Palestine, what customs were followed, what measurements were used, if he knows what cities were there and what the distances were between them, that has no bearing on the question of whether the stories he tells about Jesus are historically right.
So Bart says here that even if Luke, and let's talk about, I suppose he would, by extension, the other gospel writers, are right about all this background information that's included in the New Testament about time, people's names and places and whatnot, that has no, quote unquote, no bearing on whether or not the stories about Jesus are accurate. Is that remotely close to true? Is it remotely close to true that has no bearing? There's this, just thinking this through, just a simple analogy. If someone comes to a police station and there's an active murder investigation going along, and someone wants to commit or wants to confess to the murder, if the police are at all suspicious that this person is confessing to a crime that he did not commit, there is a tried and true method that the police use to test whether or not this person has an accurate confession, or he's just trying to, kind of aggrandize himself or get police excited about something falsely. And what they do is they walk this person through the crime itself and have this person describe the location, the house. Walk us through the house. Tell us where things are. Tell us what the murder scene looked like. Tell us what different aspects of, what weapon was used, how it was used. Now, some of this is directly on point as far as, okay, this is the center of the story, and I killed the person this way. But a lot of it has to do with just kind of contextual information. How was the house laid out? What was on the walls? Information that would not otherwise be known by someone unless they were in that house. So this is the same type of contextual information that's being provided to us by the Gospels. And Bart here says it just doesn't matter. Why doesn't it matter? I mean, you have to explain why this information doesn't matter. You can say, oh, there's other information that matters more. But if you're just going to say kind of in summary fashion, oh, this doesn't matter, what you should be looking at is this, you have to make an argument. These are just summary conclusions disguised as arguments. They're not arguments.
You can read an article in tomorrow's Guardian, which talks about something that happened in London, and the author can get everything right in terms of the geography and the measurements and the trees, and get everything right about that. But he might be completely wrong about the story he told. We're not talking about whether he's accurate about the customs. We want to know, is the article right? I mean, just as an example. Let me come up with a hypothetical example here. So suppose in 2,000 years, there's a scholar who's heard that there's a story about a debate that took place on this radio show Unbelievable in Westminster. And there's this American scholar, happens to be in England, and his name's Ehrman. And he was in Wimbledon, and he took a overground train to Vauxhall, and then he walked across the Vauxhall Bridge, and he came to, and he was going to have this debate with somebody named Pete Williams, who actually came from Cambridge. And he'd heard this story, and he wants to verify it. So he goes on an archaeological dig, and he finds there was a place called London. And it was a big place, and there was a place southwest of it, Wimbledon, and there was a train line that went to a place called Vauxhall. And oh my God, he finds that there's somebody named Ehrman who actually had a place in Wimbledon. And he digs further, and he digs in Cambridge, he finds there's Pete Williamson. But the way the story continued was that before Ehrman got to the interview, there was a big explosion in Westminster that blew up the entire neighborhood, thousands of casualties because of a gas leak. And he wants to see if that's true. And what he finds is that every geographical marking is right. There is a Wimbledon. There is a Vauxhall. There is a Westminster. There is an Ehrman. He can find all of his facts. Is he therefore right that there was a gas leak that led to an explosion that leveled Westminster?
I'm glad to say he's wrong about that.
I am too.
Because we're all here.
So I have to confess that I love arguments by analogy. I use them all the time. I, when I was in law school, I tried using them all the time, but they're very tricky. You gotta be very circumspect when you make arguments by analogy, because the analogy has got to kind of parallel the situation you're arguing. And it's something, going through the Socratic method in law school, you learn very quickly, because as the professor comes back at you and starts drilling at you on your argument by analogy, you need to be able to kind of sustain and defend your position and say, this is a correct analogy. It's a tricky thing to do. I think if any professor had a law school that uses Socratic method had heard this analogy by Bart, they'd be ready to pull their hair out of their head. There are so many things wrong with this absolutely terrible analogy he's put out there. Let's just start from the most basic question. So he's posited an era 2,500 years into the future, and essentially all this background information has been transmitted somehow. We don't know. He doesn't tell us. But let's say by oral tradition or some sort of recording of the accurate state of affairs in London area and Wimbledon area at the time. But the story concludes with some sort of kind of mass casualty event that didn't actually happen. So the very first question one has to ask, and completely missing from Bart's analogy, he doesn't address it at all. I mean, if you're going to make this a serious analogy, you're going to have to explain, where did the background information come from? How do you explain the person having all this detailed information? It's very easy to say, oh, they had all this detailed information, but it turned out that the underlying story was wrong. That's just a circular argument. You're assuming that this has come to pass in a scenario that perfectly fits what you're arguing for. You're not actually even explaining how it could have come about. And that's kind of the most powerful part of this evidence that Peter's presenting, is it's very difficult to explain how this can come about. And Bart's analogy just assumes that it does. So the argument is hugely flawed from the beginning. He has no explanation how this background information could have come about in this scenario. And that's like the biggest problem. I mean, it's just screaming off. When I heard this at the time, I was like, what are you talking about? This analogy makes no sense unless you have an explanation for how all this background information would have been transmitted 2,500 years to the future accurately, but they would have just gotten the central story wrong. But he has no mechanism for that. He doesn't even suggest one. There's no hypothetical, nothing. He just assumes it happened. I mean, just horrible. The next problem, not quite as big, but a major problem on its own, is that he's assuming that the underlying story was wrong, that somehow in the future they were able to determine that this explosion, this explosion that he describes as part of their record, whatever it is, oral transmission or whatever it is, didn't actually happen. Well, how do they establish it didn't actually happen? Or is this entirely going to be established by an archaeological dig? Is archaeology in 2,500 years in the future adequate to establish that something did not happen? That's a huge problem. I mean, I think you can talk to any archaeologist, and archaeology is good at kind of explaining discoveries that did happen. But for proving the non-existence, proving a negative, that something did not happen, it's much more difficult to do that. So how would you have established that this explosion did not happen? Isn't it just through some sort of earth sediment recovery? And I think that's highly problematic. So the analogy doesn't hold in the premise, it doesn't hold in the payoff. There's just nothing here. There's no argument here other than just kind of the assumption that what he's putting forward is true. Again, to reiterate, he does not provide even a hypothetical how the background information would have been accurately preserved for 2,500 years, but somehow this false story crept through, and how it was determined definitively that the story was false.
Okay. What I'm interested in, what Peter is arguing for, is that the author knew about the geography of Palestine. And we could have that argument, but it's not the one that really matters to people, because people don't really care that much whether they had sycamore trees there. What they really want to know is, if the New Testament says that Jesus did X, Y, and Z, did he do it or not? If the New Testament says that Jesus said this, did he say it or not? The fact that the author happens to know about the geography has no bearing on the question.
So speaking of the question, it's hard to come up with a better illustration and video of begging the question, which is exactly what Bart has done here. He says people aren't concerned about whether there was a sycamore tree in Jericho. What they really want to know is if the book says that Jesus did X, Y, and Z, did he do it or not? Well, the problem is establishing whether or not Jesus did X, Y, and Z, as is described in the book, is historically reliable, involves a lot of factors. And to just say they're not concerned about whether the sycamore tree is in Jericho is essentially arguing that underlying evidence is not important. Bart is essentially making an argument here that circumstantial evidence is not relevant at all. It's a bizarre argument, and he doesn't explain why. He doesn't explain why such circumstantial evidence and kind of familiarity with the underlying place and people and geography, why that's not relevant. He just refuses to engage on this subject. I have to say, I've kind of gone blow by blow through this. I'm still, it aggravates me to watch it. I just don't think Bart has a good response. Like, if we were to come up to Bart and say, Bart, can you please explain to us how it was that the gospel writers were able to accurately transmit what the people were named in that place at that time, and were able to accurately transmit the names of the locations, general geography, and some of the botany of the area, how they were able to accurately transmit that through whatever mechanism, if you want to call it oral tradition, or whatever other mechanism there could possibly be that resulted in a document being written down, but they were not able to accurately transmit the underlying stories. Why is that the case? And he has no answer. There's no answer here. All he says is, this is not relevant. He doesn't tell us why it's not relevant. Why doesn't it matter? Because you said so? Is that the argument? It doesn't matter because I said so? He brings up some analogy is totally flawed and makes no sense, and itself doesn't actually explain anything. So there's no explanations here. There's no kind of like counter arguments. It's just a whole bunch of, don't look at this instead, ignore this. This is not worthy of anything because I say so. It's just a terrible way to approach scholarship. And a lot of people just buy into this. Peter does respond, here somewhat. But if I was sitting across from Bart at the table there, I would have been going ballistic. I would say, Bart, how can you possibly make these arguments without explanations at all? How can you be going through the exercise of some hypothetical analogy, but have no mechanism to explain it? How can you tell us that this type of circumstantial evidence is not valid when it's the kind of circumstantial evidence that anybody would want to, historian, police officer, anybody? This is just one example of kind of these major problems you see with scholarship in this area sometimes, and arguments being made and defended. And this will be taken by people, and they'll just run all over internet and YouTube and stuff, making arguments, parroting this. And there's no backup. They just don't have sufficient support for what they're arguing. So I'm going to do another video along these lines, pointing out similar flaws in arguments being made, and we'll continue from there. So thanks for watching, everybody.